meditation techniques to achieve the same thing might spend 20 years to achieve what you can now teach a kid to do in 30 to 40 days. In fact, they operate at a higher efficiency than most of us because they can get right there, right now, and do the work that they need to do and then move on. And then go outside and get hyperactive again and burn it off. Hopefully go to sleep at night. But again, it's the use of learning how to manipulate and control your own behavior. Now, one of the other things that came out in terms of the research is that flickering light can also drive brain activity. Okay, so you can take that flicker effect and you can flash a light at, say, 10 hertz, 10 cycles per second, and your brain will begin to mirror that signal. It'll begin to fall right into that pattern, and that's the basis of light and sound devices. When you get down to low theta and delta states, they don't work very well. It's very difficult to drive into those ranges. But for alpha and for low beta states and high theta states, very, very effective. In fact, there's a number of researchers that have produced some very good work in this area. There's a number of things posted on our site dealing with light and sound devices as well. The thing about light as a medium, any of the mediums can work. I do a workshop sometimes and I break out some of the tools. I've got electroacupuncture tools. I've got electrocranial stimulation using electromagnetic fields to do the same thing that flashing light can do. Light and sound devices, just my toy box of stuff. That's good to explain some of this. But what happens with the flicker effect is, again, the brain driving, but you can also do the same thing with sound. Now, the difference with sound is you don't hear in that low frequency range. It's outside the range of human hearing. So how do you create that effect? There was a guy named Monroe. He founded the Monroe Institute, who many of you are probably familiar with. But he discovered the technique of binaural beat. The idea of putting in one signal in one ear at one frequency, and say in the case of hearing, we can hear up to about 20,000 hertz or cycles per second. Some people a little bit higher. But they maybe drive a signal in at, say, 17,000 hertz. Another signal comes in at 17,007. In the cranium, they cancel and leave a 7 hertz standing wave, and then your brain mirrors that, binaural beat. That's how it works. So like when you use those kinds of tapes, if you use a regular stereo or something, it doesn't work unless you have a headset on, so you can get those signals clearly driving in and then leaving that standing signal, that pulsed signal. And that drives the brain activity. So you can use sound, you can use light, you can use electric current. The best is light and sound because when you use electric current, you get that little bit of a shock if you crank it up too high. It's a little uncomfortable. Plus, you got to use gels, and it's messy, to get a good contact. But again, you can do this artificially. Now, let's go back to HAARP for a moment. The pulse rate, the ELF pulse rate used for communication with submarines, used for earth-penetrating tomography. The range is basically right around 20 hertz or less. Correlates perfectly with the human brain. Now they say, okay, but don't worry. When CBC on Undercurrents interviewed John Heckscher, the program manager, who's a geophysicist on this question, he said, look, it's a side effect, we're not concerned about it. From any kind of side effects that can affect what goes on in between the ears is important. There's not one biological scientist, not one electrophysiologist, no one with the requisite appropriate biological sciences assigned to HAARP at all, because they operate within the perimeters that the government says are safe. Now, when the energy comes back to the Earth, how much energy is really coming back is quite small. I mean, very small. And so people say, well, you don't have that much energy there, nothing really can happen. It's not the amount of energy. Remember the equation of the guy sitting in front of the television set, all these kids. It wasn't the amount of energy, it was the pulse rate that was relevant. It was the way in which that energy was carried in. When you look at this concept, there's a really good article that was produced by the U.S. Army War College in a publication that they have. It's a quarterly called Perimeters, and it's called The Mind Has No Firewalls. And it's a very good article about this technology and military applications of it for debilitating troops, debilitating people in a combat situation so that they're unable to fight. In fact, when you go back to this issue, what happens? So it goes up, it comes down, very low energy. How much energy does it really take? There's a guy, Jose Delgado, who some of you have probably heard about. He studied electrophysiology, University of Madrid. He graduated with a degree in electrophysiology in 1950. 1950. Most people don't even know a degree in electrophysiology even exists today, much less 51 years ago. He went to Yale University and did work there. He did work at Harvard University as well. He spent, I think, about 30 years in the United States, primarily doing brain work. He, in 1969, wrote a book called Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society. And in that book, his concept was that you could eventually learn how to manipulate human behavior and basically control outcomes in populations. And this was interesting because it was reflected later in a book called Unless Peace Comes, and in a chapter called How to Wreck Your Environment. It's kind of an interesting chapter. I guess 69, 1970 is about when that was published, and you get away with that. But it was written by a guy named J.F. Gordon MacDonald, and he was a geophysicist at UCLA, and he was also a science advisor to President Lyndon Johnson. And what he suggested was that, at that time, that if you could ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way, you could return a signal to the Earth that would manipulate the behavior of human beings over a large geographic area. Now that was interesting. In 1971, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a book called Between Two Ages, and on page 54 through 56, he amplifies and echoes those same sentiments and talks about J.F. Gordon MacDonald's work. And for those who don't remember who Brzezinski was, he was at that time a full professor at Columbia University. A few years later, he became a national security advisor to Jimmy Carter for the United States when he was president. So very powerful person, certainly knew what he was talking about. The book you should read, if you can find a copy. They're not that difficult to find. Amazingly, I think it went through like 6 or 7 printings. But Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski, and the reason I recommend it is it was written in the 70s, and he forecast what was going to happen technologically in the world over the next 30 years. And if you read it today, you would swear you were reading a history and not a forecast, because he is dead-on accurate. And almost every instance, from the breakdown of the Soviet Union to the changes in economic systems in Europe, in Asia. I mean, from economically, socially, what was happening around the world in Latin America, Africa, Europe, and Asia, and the United States and Canada. He was dead-on accurate. So I recommend it because it's worth reading. He writes in a very cumbersome style, so you might have to muddle through it. I know I did, but it's worth the read. But those particular quotes, kind of jump out at you. And then when you think about some of the things that come out more recently, one of the most interesting articles that we've read, it was there's an organization set up in the United States, and it's operated by the Central Intelligence Agency, the Foreign Broadcast Institute. I probably have that messed up, but it's basically they go out and they survey all of the printed literature in the mainstream media in 55 languages. They translate them daily, and they're used for a baseline soft intelligence, for intelligence collecting. And it's actually classified. You can't just get them. I mean, they're public documents in their own countries, but to get access to them, you have to FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request to get them. A friend of ours actually got a really interesting piece, and it was a Chinese medical journal talking about the weapons the Chinese are focused on today. And they broke them into 3 classifications. One oriented towards affecting equipment, hardware basically. One oriented towards affecting hardware, software, human beings being the software. And third, those targeted strictly for human beings. And they get into a number of things. They talk about infrasound devices openly in that article, and they talk about the frequency range in which is necessary to trigger effects within the human brain, and they talk about it in the 1 to 20 hertz range, which makes perfect sense to those that have followed the research in those areas. A good book I recommend if you're interested in that particular subtopic is a book called Megabrain by John Hutchinson, and it's a review of all of the equipment that's out there and a lot of the good research that's out there. Very well footnoted, a lot of places to go if you're interested in that particular area. Nonetheless, the Chinese approach was, look, and they take a long view. 30 years, if it takes 30 years, it's okay. I mean, it's not, no one's in a rush. The idea is that it's not, and I think the phrase that was used in the congressional report I read was the inferior defeating the superior. And it's by using technology as the key. for that battle that they see off, in fact, 30 years off into the future. Because what their belief is that it's not going to be the big, huge systems that do it. It's going to be the worms that get into the internet. It's going to be the systems that get into your electronic systems that crush them. And when you think about how many column inches in the mainstream media have been dedicated to those kinds of issues in the last few years, you'll see an increasing volume of that as terrorism becomes more widespread in terms of sophistication. You're going to see a lot more concern about these kinds of systems because they're relatively easy to build. And the information is becoming quite widely available. But when you look again at HAARP, so HAARP sends the energy up, the energy comes back, it's a small amount. What did Jose Delgado discover? In 1985, he was able to demonstrate that using radio frequency energy, the stuff of HAARP, but using radio frequency energy in a localized area at 1/50th the concentration of that which is natural within the Earth. In other words, just remember, radio frequency energy has increased 200 million times over about 100 years. Scale that back, and 1/50th of what the Earth naturally produces was sufficient and for Delgado to manipulate the behavior of primates and humans, like flipping on a light switch on and off from passive to aggressive, using that very, very low energy density at the right window frequency or pulse rate. This is the basis for those systems that the Chinese talk about, the Russians have talked about, and our own government talks about in their own literature. We have, our newest book, Earth Rising to Revolution, has 650 sources cited. I think we used 10 of them twice, and the rest were used once. Most of them are military sources that really talk about where the technology is going and where the emphasis is. And the emphasis is no longer at ripping through tissue, it's controlling the operator, the human being, affecting the human being, degrading the human condition to the point where they cannot fight a war. One of the places where we suspected some of this was used, and I say suspected because we had no evidence of it at the time, was in the Gulf War. Because you had the fourth largest army in the world, coming out like, like a fire drill out of a schoolyard, I mean, they were just panicked coming out of these bunkers. And they said, well, it's because we bombarded them so heavily, so intently. What about Dresden? What about London in World War II? I mean, nobody was giving up in that manner, and they were pounded, I mean, severely pounded. We had suspected that there was something else at play. And what came out in the Scottish media in 1997 was an article, and it was interesting, is what they said is the most devastating weapon in Iraq was infrasound. And the way they carried it in was using the radio broadcasts in the region. They embedded the signals on the radio signals. So when they came in, everyone listening to the Muslim music and Muslim prayers, which is essentially the entire Iraqi army, were given signals which generated the emotions of fear and panic. And we saw the results of it. Now that same technology was actually patented and is used commercially in Japan, and we cite the patent in the book. And what they use it there for is for dissuading shoplifters. In 7 languages, in their department stores, in many department stores, embedded on the elevator music that you hear in department stores are these signals, only they're clear. They're audio tracks that are below the level of hearing but are perceptible to the brain that actually are dissuading you from shoplifting. Same thing could be used to encourage you to buy an extra 1,000 pairs of socks, I suppose, but hopefully they won't misuse it in that way. But the idea is, the idea again is that that information can be carried in much, much different ways than previously thought. We have a section in that book, because this issue came up so much, people saying, is this stuff real, So what we did is we put together a chapter in our new book. We have over 100 sources cited in that chapter, 30 U.S. patents showing the evolution of the technology going back to the 1950s and carrying it in to the late 1990s, showing how that technology advanced. This is what's in the public record, because there's an awful lot that we know is probably out there that doesn't make the public record. We cite a number of U.S. military studies that confirm what's possible. And I'll read one of the quotes, and it came out of New World Vistas Air and Space for the 21st Century, and it was put together by the Science Advisory Board for the United States Air Force. And it's the direction in which they see this technology going. And this is the quote: "It would also appear possible to create high-fidelity speech in the human body, raising the possibility of covert suggestion and psychological direction. Thus, it may be possible to talk to selected adversaries in a fashion that would be most disturbing to them," unquote, to say the least. What they're talking about is remotely being able to transfer signal, via microwave or some other carrier into the human brain where you get that proverbial voice in the head. And that technology exists. This came out of, again, New World Vistas Air and Space for the 21st Century. The interesting thing is that's exactly what we demonstrated in the European Parliament. If you actually look up the resolution in the European Parliament, this is what it resulted in Section 27 of that resolution, which is A4-005/99. Actually, the resolution passed January 28th, 1999, almost a year after the hearing. And this is what it says on Section 27. It calls for an international convention introducing a global ban on all developments and deployments of weapons which might enable any form of manipulation of human beings. Because we were able to demonstrate that the capability existed, they were willing to put it in the body of the resolution. The other thing that's really worth looking at is that article, The Mind Has No Firewalls. It's posted on the internet. It's cited in the book, so you can go look it up. And it's, again, U.S. Army War College's website. Take a look at it and read it. I think I'll read a couple sections out of it because it actually originated in Russia. But this is, when you talk about carriers, I get asked every time, is there anything that you can do to protect yourself from this kind of technology? And the answer is no, not in terms of physical apparatus, because there's no one here, I don't believe, maybe there is, that has the resources necessary to put together everything that could be done to safeguard a person from this type of technology. And really the answer is political. The fact of the matter is anything that manipulates human behavior, anything that manipulates human mental process is fundamentally wrong. And the reason it's fundamentally wrong because it interferes with free will, something that even God won't do in most traditions, interfere with a person's free will. The idea of manipulating what goes on in the brain, if at least in the United States the founding fathers even contemplated such a thing, they would have added it right into that first segment of the Bill of Rights dealing with freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of assembly. They would have also put in freedom of thought because that's what all of that is based upon. But the idea that you can manipulate human behavior using any number of carriers, it's not the carrier, it's the signal carried on it. Just like it's not the light itself acting as a carrier off the television set, it's the pulse rate that's acting as a carrier. This is some of the stuff that were noted in that particular article. Things that are available. A psychotronic generator which produces a powerful electromagnetic emanation capable of being sent through telephone lines, TV, radio network, supply pipes, incandescent lamps. This signal would manipulate the behavior of those in contact with the signal. Another little device along the same lines, a signal generator that operates in the 10 to 150 hertz band, which when operating in the 10 to 20 hertz range creates an infrasonic oscillation that is destructive to all living organisms. Another item listed here is a nervous system generator which is designed to paralyze the central nervous system of insects, the same systems being refined to have the same effect on humans. Some of the new weapons, remember a few months ago the Marines announced their new microwave weapon for crowd control? Did any of you guys see that here in Canada? Heats up the surface of the skin, gives you the sensation of burning. Last time they used burning as a behavior modification technique was somewhere in the Middle Ages when they were burning people at stake. They brought it back. It doesn't catch you on fire, but it does create the sensation by affecting the nerves on the surface of the skin to the same sensation of burning. The thing that they didn't tell us in that is this is that one narrow band of what's possible within a broadband device. You can crank it up and you can actually create the burning. In fact, in a couple of tests that they ran, they actually did this and created burning on the surface of the skin. And the other factor is distance. What may be safe at 500 yards may not be safe at 10 yards. Someone passing in front of the signal might find themselves in distress. But the same thing is possible when you can manipulate or use that microwave as a carrier. For crowd control, this is the essence of much of the science. If you look at the Chemical and Biological Treaty, and we cite it, paragraph and section, but the big hoopla that was made over the Chemical and Biological Treaties a few years ago, actually it's now about 5 or 6 years ago, I guess, and everyone said, oh, this is a great thing. There's a clause in there, there's an exemption clause for domestic use for riot and crowd control. And it's interesting, the same time that was passing, the United States Department of Justice and the Department of Defense entered into a joint protocol where priority funding went to those things that had dual use, domestic and for Department of Justice use and Department of Defense uses in non-lethal weapons technologies. And that dialogue actually started in '85. We list in the book the 3 different work sessions between DoD in the evolution of the transfer of those technologies. the second to the last conference that they held, they said, you know, this is interesting stuff, but we really need to make sure that these meetings are open and public, because otherwise it'll create lots of distrust on the part of the public. The next meeting they had was a classified conference they held at Johns Hopkins University. The only thing that wasn't classified was the agenda, which listed the topics, and these topics that we've been discussing today were the topics on the list, among others. And it was a closed conference. Coming out of that was a joint protocol, and the exemptions are that under the Weather Modification Treaty of 1977, domestic use is permitted. In other words, you can modify the weather within your own boundaries on the theory that it never moved anywhere else, which is ridiculous on its face, but nonetheless, that is permitted. Under most international treaties, what you do within the boundaries of your own sovereign country are permitted, and that's extremely important, because when you look at international treaties like this, if there's a ban on what you can use against a foreign adversary, then there ought to be parallel domestic legislation rolling up right next to it that causes the same ban in terms of domestic use, particularly in democratic republics and democratic states. And that does not happen, and it should happen. The other thing that jumps out when you think about all of this technology, you know, is sort of where does it go next? And this is, I think, a great deal of concern to a lot of people here and all around the country, is, you know, sort of the overlaps. And what happened with us with the HAARP program and researching it is it really led to a lot of other things, and people sometimes confuse the subjects. And, you know, I've talked about a lot of different things in this first however much time we've spent, but not all of it is related to HAARP, and you need to distinguish. You know, it's like, it almost became a little bit of a joke in our office, because every time anything happened, no matter what it was, somebody wanted to blame HAARP. And the fact of the matter is, HAARP is a developmental prototype. It only does so much. It only operates a certain amount of the time of the year. It does not operate constantly. It does not operate all the time, and not everything that you see is related to it. The other thing that's happened that we've seen is there's been a certain level of disinformation out there as well regarding the facility. So we see things pop up all the time. Our view is that if there's not hard documents, again, you know, there's plenty of things to point to that are a problem. You don't need to reach for those that can't be proven yet. You know, it's just not necessary. Not at least to achieve what we hope to achieve, which is an educated public and a responsible government in terms of dealing with these technologies. You know, and when you look at the United States history in dealing with new technologies, you know who the biggest polluter in the United States is? The United States government, primarily the military. When you look at the list of all of the toxic waste cleanup sites in the country of the United States, and you'll see most of it is related to government activity and not private sector activity, which I think is, again, you know, you're sort of immune from the law when you are the law. At least that's their perception in the way they project it out in the public. One of the things that came out during the Clinton administration, there are a lot of good things and bad things in the Clinton administration. One of the things that came out that I thought was pretty interesting was when Secretary of Energy O'Leary was commenting on human experimentation in the United States, and what she came out with was, she said over 500,000 Americans over 40 years had been experimented on without their consent. 500,000 people. Now that's what they acknowledge, but 500,000 people, and not one single solitary soul has ever been held accountable for that. No one stood in front of a jury of their peers and been held accountable or responsible for any of it. From my perspective, again, you know, that's a greater crime than virtually anything that the United States could have contemplated. I mean, those were the things that people swung by their necks in Nuremberg for, were human experimentation without consent. But what came out of that? I mean, what kinds of things came out of that? This year in the United States budget is reconciliation, money for the indigenous Alaskans that were injected with radioactive iodine to see how they'd thrive or not in Arctic conditions. We had a few years ago, if people remember, black Americans in the Southeast were used to decide how syphilis acted over the course of 20 or 30 years. For those that remember, even going back further into the 70s, the revelations came out of the congressional hearings on the use of servicemen and hallucinogenics to see what would happen to them over the course of time. Over 6,000 people were involved in that. There's a U.S. congressional report on the subject that was prepared in 1976. It was chaired, one of the chairs was Ronald Reagan, and I believe, I think it wasn't Carter, it was during his administration. I can't remember the other guy, but it's referenced in both of our books. But the point being that human experimentation takes place. And the idea that, that we would do this, and who are the people that were targeted, the things that O'Leary was really excited about, really upset about, was children, disadvantaged people, minority groups, people who are disenfranchised and out of the mainstream. In our country, routinely, whether they were incarcerated in prisons or whether they were free people that were subjected to that kind of thing, this happened all the time. And the idea was, well, it's going to end, it's not going to happen anymore, but all you have to do is open the paper, and every once in a while you'll see the revelations of the latest event of some human experiment gone awry that somebody didn't get fully informed consent over. These are the things that I think we find the most objectionable and the most, I think, criminal, and they should be criminal. A couple of examples, and I'm going to give some personal stories along the line because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about. And only recently have I really started talking about some of this, but my father was in the Congress in the early 70s, and that was a pretty interesting time in the United States. That was pre-Watergate days. My dad was a pretty interesting guy. He died at age 40, so he was about 3 years younger than I am now. And what he had worked on and what he had just accomplished was he had settled the largest land claim settlement in the history of the United States. He transferred through the Congress 44 million acres of land to indigenous Alaskans, subsurface rights, energy rights, mineral rights, air rights, everything with it. And along with a little under $1 billion, which in 1971 was a lot more money than it is today. Nonetheless, that legislation passed. That created a real unique situation in Alaska. Essentially, 1% of Alaska is privately owned, 9% is native owned because of that legislation, and the rest is government. So there's very little private land there. And it shifted a lot of energy resources, a lot of mineral resources into essentially indigenous hands. He had done that in his first year in the Congress, which was unheard of, in terms of that. And he was really well plugged in. When he was a young guy in his teens, he worked for Hubert Humphrey's first campaign for the United States Senate. He actually operated Humphrey's campaign in northern Minnesota as a young Democrat, really worked hard. As a consequence, they were friends. So when Dad went to the Congress in the early 70s, he was plugged directly in the power structure. And a person he became well acquainted with was a guy named Hale Boggs, who at the time was the majority leader for the United States House, one of the most powerful people in the United States. A couple years before, he had started getting really agitated with J. Edgar Hoover's work because he felt like J. Edgar Hoover was someone that didn't belong in government, didn't belong in bureaucracy, and was routinely violating the rights of American citizens and elected officials by invading their privacy. And on April 6th, 1971, on the floor of the Congress, he called for J. Edgar Hoover's resignation. And there weren't very many politicians that believed that back then. In fact, most people, the popular opinion was that Hale Boggs was all wet, he shouldn't have been doing that. The reality was, as we've learned from history, that this guy was a tyrant. I mean, he literally controlled much of the political outcomes in the United States by manipulating politicians by having something on them, which we thought was kind of interesting. And why I bring it up is 3 weeks before Watergate broke, Hale Boggs was driven to the airport, met my dad in Washington, went to Alaska to campaign for my father for his second election. And the night before they flew up from Anchorage to Juneau on a small plane, he really announced that there was a big scandal brewing in Washington. He didn't get into the details. No one really knew what he was talking about. Next morning they got on the plane disappeared from the radar screen, and was never heard or seen from again. 39 days, the biggest air search in the history of the United States. They used SR-71s, everything that was available. My dad was a very popular statesman in Alaska. There were 400 private fishing vessels, 400 private planes at least involved in the search. Never found a trace. Until 1993, Roll Call, which is a newspaper in Washington, D.C., it's a pretty well-respected newspaper. I think it was April 3rd, 1993, they released an article. And what they had done is they'd gone in and FOIA'd all of the government offices, and they were investigating congressional deaths and disappearances starting in the early 70s, because there were several that had occurred over a period of time. First ones they ran into were my dad and Boggs, and the thing that came out of the FBI was 2 telexes indicating that the plane had been located using sophisticated surveillance technologies in California. Those telexes, one of them completely is posted on my site, and I have half of the other one posted on the site, indicating where the plane was, and that there were 2 people still living at the site. The plane was never found. That came out, years later. The History Channel just did a 1-hour segment that dealt with this issue. It aired just a couple months ago. But what was going on then? Here it was. They supposedly found the plane. The coordinates were very precise. That information was sent from California to FBI offices in Washington, and that's where it stayed. And when you go back to the record, and when we got the telexes to look at them to try and figure out who was involved, what companies were involved, all of that was blacked out under national security. And I guess when we finally found out that this was sort of out there in the background, it didn't really surprise me, quite frankly. Boggs was the kind of guy that wasn't beyond punching you out if you didn't agree with him. He was kind of an aggressive sort of guy. But he was a guy that really believed in what he did and really got involved in what he did. And the fact that he was willing to take on Hoover at a time when nobody would, at a time when our government was probably at one of its lowest points, at least in terms of the public's awareness of it, I think speaks volumes for what was happening in the country at the time. But when I look back on all that, I mean, what effects does that have on today? Well, the same problems that exist in the FBI then are the same problems that were the subject of congressional hearings in the last several weeks. It deals with accountability, deals with government running away with itself, feeling immune, capable of doing whatever they want without any accountability whatsoever. And that's really the root of a lot of this. It has very little to do with a specific set of circumstances, whether it's HAARP or something else. That underlying problem is one of accountability. And that's really where we've tried to take our issues, is to say, okay, what can we do to create mechanisms of accountability where government becomes more responsive to the population and less responsive to itself, as a bureaucracy fueling itself. And a couple of things that we've thrown out. I mean, one of them is this kind of activity where we have a chance to have a conversation, talk about what we're doing, talk about what's out there, provide the evidence. One of the things that happened early on when we started doing this work, we thought, okay, what's working? What's really working anymore to get information out? And you look at the traditional ways that science is revealed. It goes through scientists and academics and eventually maybe makes it into the media, maybe not. But it sort of swills there for maybe a decade or so before it finally breaks out, right? And then we looked at it and we said, okay, what do I know from my background that might take an issue out a little faster and a little further to get it out to people? And what we did is, in fact, BBC picked up on this. They said it was the first technological protest, in the sense that we used radio, we used internet, we used fax machines and telephones, whatever was available to us to get the issue out, to inform people so that they could form opinions and then act on those opinions. And we took it this way. We kept getting pressed into people kept saying, you need to put an organization together, you need to have an organization, so you have this structure and all of this. And I said, nope, we're not going to do that. So I've been involved in organizing a good bit of my life, either politically, union organizing, a lot of other kinds of organizing activities. And what happens is, when you have those hierarchical structures, people keep handing off their responsibility to you, And then you spend your time arguing about who's going to run the show and who's going to deliver the information, who's going to do what. Nonsense. I didn't want to have anything to do with that. And so we wouldn't do it. We decided that we were going to be a mob of one or two. And our objective was to get people to just think about the issues, look at the evidence, draw their own conclusions, and act in their own self-interest, whatever that was. Whether it meant talking to a friend, whether it meant writing a letter, whether it meant doing a letter to the editor, whether it meant something else more than that. Our view was that our objective was to let people know what was out there and then ask them to do what they saw in front of them that was possible to do. And along that theme, we were able to take an issue from the moon, from Alaska, from a place so far removed from the mainstream, and make it an international issue, get a resolution to the European Parliament on subject matter that most people didn't think you'd have a snowball's chance in hell of getting anywhere with. We were able to carry it that far. And our objective was that if we could instill in people this sense that maybe that we each can do something, that would be a good first step. And I used to contemplate when I was younger, what faith was. And everybody has this thing they wrestle with over their lifetimes maybe, and sometimes they resolve it. For me, faith is a very simple thing. It's knowing what you need to do and stepping into it, taking an action, some action. Simple as that. You know, and it doesn't matter whether you fail or whether you succeed. It only matters whether you make the effort, because if no movement is made, nothing happens, I guarantee you. And failing isn't necessarily bad either. I mean, sometimes you fail and you learn a lot by the failure. I think anyone in here with any gray hair can say, yeah, the worst things in my life are the best learning experiences of my life also. And I think that's true about all of us. But it's the act of doing. It's just rising out of the ashes of our own apathy to recognize our own potentials and act upon them. And I think that's really where the rubber meets the road. And we can sit around and talk about all these things. We can identify all the problems. And the thing that I liked about what was happening here this year is the solution sign, because that's what we're all supposed to be focused on. And the reason I like it is because my brothers and I have this kind of working rule. When we go into a meeting that's conflict, nobody gets to identify a problem unless they identify a solution. And I think that's really a good working rule, whether it's this kind of a setting or any kind of a setting where you're in discussing problems. Because what happens otherwise? You spend your whole time dissecting the problem 50 million ways till you can see it from every angle, but you haven't solved anything. The reality is, if you have to come up with a solution when you identify the problem, it may not be the one reached or arrived at, but you'll be arguing about the solution rather than the problem, and eventually you'll get to the end of that tunnel. So, a good working rule. The other thing that used to come up all the time was, nobody cares, nobody does anything, we can't get enough interest, and after all, maybe only 8 or 10% of the population even vote in elections. And I say hurrah, because you only have to change 5 or 6% of the population's mind to get them to show up at the poll and pull the lever. It's a lot easier than 51%, believe me. But even the worst situations, you can turn them around, look at them a little differently. But the point is, where does it all start? It starts with education. It starts there. I mean, a lot of things we've talked about are a little bit unnerving, but the reality is they're only unnerving when you don't have the answers. You have sort of a half a deck. But when you begin to work on a solution, the worry, the fear, those kinds of things dissipate very rapidly, because now you're doing something. You're acting on that faith, that effort. It may be simple for some people it may be as simple as a smile on the street to somebody you don't know, who's on their way to blow their brains out, and you change their mind because somebody showed them just one grain of human compassion at the right moment. You don't know what you're going to do. You don't know who you're going to touch. You don't know what you're going to stimulate if you don't do something. And the other thing that comes in is a lot of frustration. People see this big vision in front of them. And I don't see Jean here. My co-author, Jean Manning, on my first book is actually from Vancouver. She's Canadian. She was supposed to be here today. I was hoping she would be. But nonetheless, one of the things she said early on when we were first working on the book, she said, she was feeling all this anxiety, about, we got to get this message out. We got to get this message. I said, no. I said, relax. I said, the only thing we got to do is write the book. Let's just write the book, and the rest will take care of itself. Let's just do the part that we're skilled at and that we know we're responsible for, and that's putting it down in a reasonable, coherent form. And the rest will work itself out, and we'll get it out there. And the thing I'm saying in that is, if you've got a lot of anxiety attached to the idea of doing something, chances are you're either moving too fast, too far, in the wrong direction. Because my own experience, at least, is that there's always a little bit of resistance, but when you push against it, if it moves relatively easily, it's probably a good thing. If it's like pushing up against a brick wall, pull back just a little bit. Because it's not the impossible that each of us is called to do, it's only the possible, and the possible is what's in front of us at the moment that we can step into easily and readily, and the next thing reveals itself. And I think that's true. But in looking at sort of the big circle of all of this, we were looking at it again from this sort of, okay, how do we motivate people to act in their own self-interest? And we started writing some of the ideas down. In fact, on the web, there's a bunch of essays under a button called Political Empowerment, and I encourage you to go to our website, and if you want to write it down, I'll give it to you now. It's earthpulse.com, earthpulse.com. And the button you want to go to is called Political Empowerment, and there's a series of about 6 or 7 essays. One in particular that might be useful to you if you're interested in creating change is called Change Agents in Reality Creation. The phrase change agents has been used a lot more by other people these days. Back when I wrote that article, it was 1995, and it wasn't used at all that I knew about. Now people are using it, which is great. But the idea is, in this, I could have titled it "A Fistful of Quarters in a Phone Booth," you know, because the same effect would be there. It's how to actually politically organize around any issue, whether it's worrying about the dog catcher next door or something as complicated as perhaps HAARP. But it's just a template that can be followed. It can be followed in the U.S. It can be followed in Canada, and it's just some simple things that individuals can do to politicize, or at least to introduce others to the ideas and things that are important to you. So I'd encourage you to read that, copy it, circulate it, pass it around. It's on the internet for people's use. But again, kind of looking at it, okay, so how else can we use what's available to us to get the story out? And we focused on talk radio as a major vehicle for us. And I work with 200 radio producers that are actually involved in 2,500 radio markets in the United States, Canada, and around the world. And you know, we use them quite frequently to introduce ideas and introduce materials, and we're called often to really report or to clarify issues for them. I have one guy that works with me, James Roderick. He's my co-author. He's been with me about 7 years. This time he's on the book Earth Rising. He really is one of the main people behind the scenes that nobody ever gets to see. But Jim is full-time researcher for me. He spends 30 hours a week in the office doing strictly research. We index 200 to 300 articles and papers a month. Sometimes as many as 400 in a month will get indexed into our archive. So it's a big project, but continually we're pulling information in. A lot of people, just like yourselves, send us things all the time. That helps us a great deal. It gives us a multiplier effect in terms of people looking at things. Some of the things we get may not be useful at the time, but we don't throw them away. We set them aside and we wait until we see what else comes in. And so if you run across something you think might be of interest to us, please send it. You never know. It might hook that, it might be that little missing piece in the foundation that puts things in order for us. So you'll be surprised at some of the things that have shown up. A lot of times information will report within a region but not migrate across the wire services. So things happen in regions of the country, regions of the world that never make it into the mainstream because